Today is going to be a complete crash course on how to use Recoil for state management within React.js. I am going to go over some of the conceptual foundations of Recoil, like what it is, what it's good for, what are different atoms, selectors, and how to kind of use it overall. But in today's video, we're going to build an application with it and show you kind of a live demonstration, a practical application of how to use it. But if you want kind of more in-depth explanations of each of the things we talk about here today, you can see those videos at the kind of earlier on in this playlist. All right. So first off, what I've done here is I have just created a basic create React app. I just ran the command npx create React app, and you can see that right over here in these docs. If you just do npx create React app and you run that in the terminal and you give your app some name, that will just spin up a new React app. All right. But now let's install Recoil and kind of get started with that. So Recoil, and I'm just going to copy and paste this here and head back to my terminal here. And I'm going to install Recoil. And for Recoil, it is a state management library that is used to manage state within React. A little bit self-explanatory there. But what I really like about Recoil and kind of the promise of Recoil is that it allows you to manage state and share state across different components within React without needing to write a bunch of boilerplate like you might in something like Redux or MobX or other state management libraries like that. So not a ton of boilerplate, which you will see once we set it up here. And then also, it's very React-ish, meaning Recoil just gives you some hooks to manage state, and it's very similar to the React hooks like useState, useReducer, and different things like that. So conceptually, there's not a huge jump from just going from React to Recoil in managing state. It really just allows you an easier way to share state across components, and I think a better way than using something like context. And honestly, I think you can get very far just using Recoil rather than needing to pull in something like Redux or something like that. All right. So let's start kind of setting up this app here. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to just run my app. So I'm going to run npm start here, and that's going to start my app in my browser here. And it is currently on another page. So let me pull it in here. And as you can see, I just have an app that has this great UI right now that just says, hey. So with that, we're going to create just a basic to-do app. And I know it's like the cliche app to make in tutorials and stuff, but it is going to be enough to give us everything we need to get started with Recoil and for this crash course. All right. So let's first start creating our state management stuff here. So I'm first going to create a folder within my src file here. I'm going to go new folder, and I'm just going to call it state. And within this folder, we're going to create two separate folders. We're going to create an atoms folder for our Recoil atoms, which I will cover in just a second. And before I get to that, say hi to Ragnar in the background there, looking at me like, Dad, why are you looking at this camera and like talking to it? And while he licks himself, I will block him from the view here. So we're going to create an atoms and selectors folder within this state folder. So we're going to call this one atoms. And then I'm going to do another one here called selectors. And within our atoms folder, well, we're going to create a to-do application here. So eventually I'm going to create an atom to manage my to-do state. And I'll explain atoms in just a second here, but let's set up this UI just a little bit more here that is going to just give us what we need to start adding that state. So let's just get the UI set up, and then we'll add the state later. And in my professional applications, that's generally what I like to do. I like to get my UI in place, and then I will set up the state at some later point. So let's add a new folder here, and let's just go components. Did I spell components right? I think so. So within here, we're just going to have a todos.jsx, and then we're also going to have a to-do.jsx. I can't talk at all today. So within our to-dos, we're going to render out individual to-do components. So let's first start within this to-do file, and I'm going to just go export default function to-dos, and then we're just going to return. Let's return. This is going to be like the wrapper for all of our to-dos here. So I'm going to have a main here, and then for our to-do UI, well, we're probably going to want a input here. So let's do an input, and then an input needs a type of, and I'm just doing all this off the top of my head. There's definitely going to be some stuff that I forget. And then maybe an ID called to do input, although I don't think I'm going to add a label here, although maybe for semantic HTML, that might be a good idea, but we're just going to forget about that right now. So this is going to be an input. And then I'm also going to want a couple of buttons, right, to add my to-dos. So I'm going to add a button here, and this is just going to say add to do. And then I think within my to-do component, I'll handle deleting to-dos. So right now I will just do another button that says clear to-dos, and we will handle the logic here once we get our state set up here. So now I have my to-dos, and now I just need to render those within my app. So I'm going to say, hey, and then let's render out my to-dos component here and check out, did I do it right? All right, so we have some UI here. We have an input. This is where you can type out a to-do, and then once we click add to-do, that will add a to-do down here, and then once we clear, that will clear all of our to-dos. Okay, so with that, let's head back here. I think I'm ready to start adding some state here. So let's go to my atoms folder, and let's add a new file here called to-do state. And I'm just going to do .js because we're just going to write JavaScript in here. We're not going to write any JSX. All right. So now I want to set up my atom, and an atom within Recoil is just a single slice of state, a single unit of state. And then within your components, different components can use these atoms. And when they use these atoms, that's technically called subscribing to these atoms. And then when these atoms update or they change, when your state updates or changes, then that will be reflected within that component that subscribes to that state or that uses that state. All right, so atoms are just ways to create the separate slices of state, and they are all independent of each other. So if a component subscribes to one atom, if a separate atom updates, that component doesn't care. It's not going to re-render. It's only going to re-render when an atom that it uses is changed. All right, so let's head back to the Recoil docs here and create our first atom. And this reminds me, before we do that, in order to use our atoms, what we're going to have to do is wrap our application within this Recoil root component. And this just allows us to use Recoil state within our components. So a common convention in programming is that for some of these libraries, like I know this is true for like some different routing libraries like React Router DOM, or to use material UI themes within your components, you might need to wrap them with some sort of root component. And you have to do this within Recoil. And you can see we just need to import Recoil root from Recoil and then wrap our component with it right here. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to do it within our app component. I'm going to say import Recoil root from Recoil. And then here, we're going to just wrap our entire app with this Recoil root component. And I'm going to copy and paste this within my Recoil root. And I should have like prettier turned on here to automatic format, but that's not going to really change what you take away from this tutorial. So we'll just live with it for now. All right, so now I've wrapped it in my Recoil root, and now I'm ready to go create this atom. Now, when you create an atom, you're going to have to give it a key and a default state. So as you can see, an atom represents a single piece of state. Atoms can be read from and written from any component. Components that read the value of an atom are implicitly subscribed to that atom. So any atom updates will result in a re-render of all components subscribed to that atom. Okay, so with that, you can see that we create an atom by calling this atom function that we import from Recoil, and we give it a key. So it should be a unique ID. So Recoil can differentiate between these atoms. And then you also give it some default value if that is appropriate. So let's just copy this atom here, head back to our application and paste it in here. But instead of text state, we're going to call it to-do state. And that's also going to be our key. And our default value is just going to be an empty array, because for our to-dos, we're going to manage those within an array. It's just going to be an array of objects that have text and probably like an ID. All right, so we need to import atom from Recoil here. All right, so now I have this to-do state, and I'm going to actually make sure to export this to-do state from this file so I can then import it into the components in which I want to use this to-do state. All right, so let me just go back to my browser here and make sure I didn't break anything. It looks like I didn't, so that is always good to see. So now let's head back into my to-dos here, and I want to start managing state in here. So I want to, within this, when I add a to-do, I'm going to want to set some of my to-do state. And when I clear to-dos, I'm also going to want to set my to-do state, but I'm just going to want to remove all my to-dos. And also within this to-dos component, you can imagine that I'm going to want to loop over my to-dos and maybe map those and return a to-do component for every to-do. So I'm going to both need the value of my to-dos as well as a way to set my to-do state. So within Recoil, you do that by to-dos and set to-dos is equal to use Recoil state. And then this use Recoil state hook, it's going to take an atom or a selector. Okay, so this use Recoil state hook, I'm going to pass it an atom or a selector for whatever piece of state that I want to use here. So I'm going to say I want to use my to-do state right here. So now I should have access to all of my to-dos within my to-do state atom, and I can also set those, because this use Recoil state hook, it returns the very same thing that the use state hook does in React. It returns an array of two values, your current state as well as a way to set that state. And I'm just destructuring those here using the square bracket notation. All right, so you can see that this is very React-ish. It's just like the use state hook, but use Recoil state. All right, so now that I have access to my to-dos here, as well as my set to-dos, well, I can now go about implementing this add to-do function. So I'm going to just write a function here called add to-do. And what am I going to want to do here? So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to set my to-dos. And this setter function is going to work just like it does in React. We can pass it an inline function here, or any function, and it's going to pass us the previous state to that function. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return my previous to-dos, but also my new to-do. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to spread all of my previous to-dos in this array, and then I'm going to want to create a new to-do. And within my new to-do, I'm going to give it some ID here, and I'm just going to be lazy about it and use math.random. You would not want to do this within a professional application, but for our purposes, this is going to be fine. Now for the text here, well, I'm going to want to set it to my input text. So I'm going to create that state here in just a second, but let's do input text. And let me hide this Explorer here so you can see the full page. So I'm going to set it to my input text. So I need to create that state. And I'm just going to say input text, comma set input text. And I'm just going to use React state here because I only need this state locally to this component. I don't need to share it across my application. So I'm just going to use use state, and then I need to import this from React. So I'm going to go import use state from React. And I think I did that import correctly, but I'll know here in a second if I did or not. All right, so I'm going to, for my add to do, I'm going to take all of my previous to-dos, I'm going to add them into my to-dos array, and then I'm going to add a new to-do with an ID and text set to whatever my input text is right here, which also means I need to set this value to be my input text, and I need to set an onChange handler is equal to handle input change. And I'm going to write a function here called handle input change, and it's going to receive an event, and I'm going to want to set my input text to my event.target.value here. All right. So whenever this input changes, it should set my input text to whatever it changes to. And I'm going to console log my input text here. And we're going to see if all that code I just wrote is correct or not. So let's head back here. Let's open up my inspector. Let's go to my console. Let's clear it out. Let's get rid of whatever that is. And let's start typing. So you can see I do get an error. A component is changing from uncontrolled to controlled. This is likely blah, 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 blah. And I think I know what that is. So let me fix that real quick. So the reason I'm getting this right now is because I'm not setting a default value here with useState, but now I am, an empty string. So I think that'll fix it because it's no longer going to go from controlled to uncontrolled. So let me clear that and let me start typing, and you do see it fixes it. And then you can also see that my input text is being set to whatever I type in my input here. All right. And within my add to do, after I add a to do, I'm going to want to reset my input to just a blank string. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right here. All right. So I think the last thing I need to do here, and instead of console logging my input text, I'm going to console log my to-dos. And I'm going to add a couple of to-dos. So I'm going to say on click here is equal to, if I could type worth a damn today, what's it called? Add to do. All right. So theoretically, when I click on my add to do button, it should run this function here and add a to do with whatever my input text is. So let's go ahead, clear this, to do 1. And as you can see, I don't have any to-dos left in my array currently because I haven't clicked add to do. But when I do that, I do get an error saying input text is not a function. We're going to ignore that for the time being. And we're just going to look at my to-dos here. And you can see I've added one to-do with an ID here, just math.random, and a text of to-do 1. And I think the error here, so I see that I didn't clear my to-dos because it says input text is not a function. I bet you I tried to call my input text instead of my set input text. So I did. Let me do that right here. Set input text to a blank string. Okay, that should be good now, but we can see we are now adding to-dos within our use recoil state. Now, what we have to do here is let's also write this clear to-dos function. OnClick is going to equal clear to-dos, and I'm going to write a function here called clear to-dos. And all we need to do is we need to do set to-dos to an empty array. And that is just going to effectively reset this state to an empty array and clear out our to-dos. So I'm confident this will work without testing it. Maybe I shouldn't be very confident considering the bugs I've already written. But now let's go ahead and open this back up and let's write our to-do component. So export default function to do, and we are going to return, let's return like some really beautiful UI here. So let's return like, you know, a div with a p tag that has our to do text in it. And then also let's just do a button that has, let's just do an X. And for this on click, what we're going to do is call our delete to do function. So when I render these to dos out, I'm going to pass it a couple of props, and I'm going to pass it the text that I'm setting for my to dos as well as an ID. And what I'm going to do here is I need to access my to do state tier, because when I delete a to do, I'm going to want to delete that to do from my overall global to do state. So to do that, all I need is the set recoil state function, because I just need to set the state. I don't need to actually read from it within this component. So I can say const set to dos is equal to use set recoil state. And within recoil, it has functions for use set recoil state. It also has use recoil state, which we already talked about. It also has use recoil value if you just need to read the value and you don't need a setter. So it has a bunch of different hooks depending on your use case. But here it has a very similar API in which I just, to use set recoil state, all I need to do is pass it an atom here. So I'll pass it my to do state atom. And now I can write my function for delete to do. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set my to-dos, and I'm going to pass an inline function with my previous to-dos. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to return my previous to-dos, but I'm going to filter those to-dos, and the filter method is going to return an array, which is going to be perfect for our to-dos here. And for this filter function, it's going to pass every to-do to this filter function. And if you're not sure how this filter function works in JavaScript, I have videos covering it more in depth. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to check todo.id is not equal to my ID that I pass within props here. So what it's going to say is if I return true here, that's going to filter those into my to-dos right here. It's going to set those as my to-dos. But if my ID is equal to my todo.id, that's going to return false, and it's not going to include that in my to-dos array here. So that's going to allow me to delete each of these individual to-dos, at least theoretically, before I test this. So I think that looks good. And let's go back over here, and now let's render out my to-dos. And let me hide this here. So to do that, we're just going to take our to-dos, and then we're going to map over them, and that's going to give us a to-do, and then we are going to return a to-do component here. And then what do we need to pass this component? We need to pass it text and ID. So here we can say text is equal to to-do.text, and ID is going to be equal to to-do.id. And when I render out a component and I loop over it like I'm doing now, I need to pass it a key prop for React. So we'll set that as the to-do ID. Okay. So let's go back to the browser and see if I messed anything up. And it doesn't look like I did. So I have one to-do within my to-do state here, and you can see that being rendered out here. If I add another to-do and another to-do, and I delete one, you could see that it deletes that to-do. So surprisingly enough, everything's working here on my first go. That doesn't happen every time, just to be clear. Okay, so we have these to-dos. And that should give you an idea of sharing state between components within Recoil. But there's another key concept of recoil you need to understand. So let's just go over this real quickly here. So all I did to use this global state here is I created this atom to-do state, and then I read and write from that within this to-dos component here using the use recoil state, passing my to-do state atom. And then I do this similar thing within my to-do component. I use the use set recoil state, and that gives me access to that state because recoil gives you global access to state to share across components. And this allows me to delete my individual components within this state here. But there's one last thing I want to show you, and that is how selectors work. So let's go ahead and write a selector that just tells us how many to-dos we have left for today. And if you're anything like me, you hate having a bunch of to-dos on the list. So this is not going to be necessarily fun to create, but let's do it anyway. So for my selectors here, I'm going to create a to-do selector, and I'm just going to say total to-dos .js. And within this file here, we're going to create a selector. So let's go back to the Recoil docs. And as we can see here, a selector represents a piece of derived state. So yes, selectors allow you to derive a certain value from some piece of state. So I can use my to-do state to derive some other value. And in this case, I'm going to use my to-do state to derive how many total to-dos that I have. So instead of creating a whole nother piece of state called total number of to-dos and creating an atom for that and going through all that, I'm just going to use a selector here to derive this new state based on some other state. So it says it is a transformation of state. You can think of derived state as the output of passing state to a pure function that modifies the given state in some way. All right, and here's kind of how it's going to look. So let me copy this, go back to this file, and you can see that to create a selector, you call the selector function within Recoil, and let me import that here. Import selector from Recoil. And in doing this here, I need to pass this selector function an object that contains a key and get property. The key is going to be just like a unique value, just like our atoms had a key in those. So I'm going to call this total to-dos. And I'm going to make sure to export this as well. I'm going to export this here. And I'm also going to give my key that value. And then for my get property, this is where I write my selector function. And I write whatever value that I want to use. So this get property, the function that you pass to it here, so this is passing an inline function here and returning some value. You can see here that to this inline function, Recoil is automatically going to pass it an object that has a get property on it. And this get property is going to allow you to access any of your Recoil state. And you just pass an atom to this get property. So I want to get my to-do state here. So I'm going to call this get function coming from this argument right here. But I want to pass it my to-do state. And I'm going to call this my to-do state. And what I want to return is my to-do state dot length. That is going to be how many to-dos that I have within my to-do state. Okay. So now I've written this selector that returns how many to-dos that I have within my to-do state here. So I'm going to go back to my to-dos component, and below, let's go to my app component. I'm going to say, hey, and then let's do another one. Let's do like a H3 below all of my to-dos and say total to-dos. Now I'm going to want to access my total to-dos. So what I can do here is I can say const total to-dos, and I'm going to say total to-do state is equal to use recoil value here. And I can pass this a selector. And the selector I'm going to pass it is going to be my total to-dos here. And this is going to give me access to my total to-dos value that I can then render right here. And if I didn't mess anything up, which I can see I already did, I want to render out my total to-do state like so. All right, so if I didn't mess anything up and I go back to my browser, you can see that I get a bunch of errors. Okay, this component must be inside a recoil root. Ah, you are right. So here's a key point. I am using my selector up here before this recoil root. So the way that you can fix this is push your recoil root higher up. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to actually put my recoil root wrapping around my app right here. And this should get rid of this error because I need to make sure it's wrapped around app.js since I'm trying to use this selector right here before my recoil root right here. Now I can get rid of this since I already wrap it around this entire app function. All right. So now let's go back to the browser. And it looks like I'm still getting some errors here. Cannot access to-do state before initialization. And I think I figured out the problem here. So I named this the same as when I named this because I do not think things through all the time. So let's adjust that a bit. And hey, I have now fixed it. Let's add some to-dos here. Let's do 1, 2, and 3. So here we can see I have 3 to-dos. Total to-dos is 3. So you can see everything is working correctly here. And just to kind of recap, within my application here, I have this to-do state atom that allows my to-dos and my to-do component to both kind of read and write to that state. And then within my app component right here, I use a to-do state selector to derive a value based on my to-do state that just renders out nice and cleanly right here based on my total to-dos. So that is a rundown of how atoms and selectors and how recoil works in general. As you can see, it's very React-ish, and it is a very cool library that I definitely enjoy using. So thanks for tuning into this, and I'll see you in that next one.